I was still fuming from the argument with Daniel. It shouldn't have gotten so out of hand, but after hours of driving, the smallest thing started to boil over. By the time he made his last snide comment, I'd had enough. I needed a break. From him, from the car, from everything. Without thinking, I veered onto a narrow side road, telling Daniel I would find a shortcut, ignoring his objections as I watched him get smaller in the rearview mirror. All I wanted was a few minutes alone. Besides, the road looked like it really might cut through to the highway faster than the main route. But as I drove further, a strange feeling began to gnaw at me. The road had narrowed more than I expected, becoming a rugged path lined by twisted trees that leaned close, almost swallowing the way forward. Each tree seemed to loom larger, casting distorted shadows under the faint starlight. There was something unnatural about them, their branches crooked and reaching as if they wanted to latch onto the car. The silence weighed heavy around me, more than just the absence of sound. It was as if the world had been muted entirely. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the hum of distant traffic. Just me and the gravel crunching under my tires. My heart beat a little faster, but I shook it off, forcing myself to focus on the road. Yet something felt wrong. I thought about going back the way I came to get Daniel, apologize for my outburst, but I noticed how the path didn't quite make sense. The turns and dips felt unnatural, as if the road twisted in ways I couldn't remember, like it was trying to confuse me. I tried to laugh it off, chalking it up to exhaustion, but my grip tightened on the steering wheel, fingers stiff with a chill I couldn't explain. The sun had disappeared completely, and the only light now came from my headlights cutting through the darkness ahead. Occasionally, my beams would catch a movement in the trees, shadows shifting just at the edge of my sight. I told myself it was a trick of the light, maybe a deer or some animal scurrying away. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I could almost feel eyes watching, tracking me from the shadows just beyond the trees. I fought the urge to look back, not wanting to confirm what I already feared. And then, I saw it. At the edge of my headlights, half hidden by fog, a small weathered sign leaned by the side of the road. The letters were too faded to read, smeared and warped as though someone had tried to scratch them out. The sign felt ancient, as if it hadn't been touched in years, or decades. I slowed, squinting to make out the letter, but they twisted and blurred in the darkness. Just then, my headlights flickered, casting a series of wild shadows across the road, and in one brief moment, I thought I saw something. A figure in the rearview mirror, faint and shadowy, standing in the middle of the road behind me. My heart hammered as I whipped around to look, but there was nothing, just empty road. "Get it together," I muttered, forcing a laugh that sounded thin and hollow. But the prickle on the back of my neck wouldn't fade. Every instinct told me to turn around, go back, forget the shortcut and find Daniel. But the road pressed forward, and I pressed forward with it, feeling that strange sensation I wasn't alone, growing stronger with each mile. The road seemed to stretch endlessly in front of me no matter how much I drove. I kept my eyes glued to the dimly lit path, trying to shake the eerie feeling that kept creeping up my spine. The fog had thickened now. Wet clouds that wrapped around my car like a suffocating blanket. My headlights barely cut through it, and I had to slow down, squinting to keep the road in view. The air felt heavier, thicker. The quiet was unnerving. I tried turning on the radio, hoping for some kind of distraction. But all I got was static, crackling, hissy noises filling the space around me. I adjusted the dial, but no matter where I tuned it, the same sounds tortured my ears. It was as though the very frequency itself was alive, trying to get my attention. I slammed the button off in frustration, and just as I did, I heard something, a faint whisper, or maybe just my mind playing tricks. I couldn't tell. At first, I thought it was just exhaustion playing with my senses. I'd been driving for hours without stopping, my mind clouded by the argument, the anger still lingering in my chest. But then I noticed something that stopped my heart. There were no signs of life. No cars, no houses, no lights, not even a single animal crossing the road. Just endless trees, twisted and unnatural, the road cutting through a dense, hollow silence. I glanced at my phone, hoping for some sign of civilization ahead, maybe a signal to reassure me. But when the screen lit up, it was nothing but a blank message. There was no signal, no service. Nothing. My hands tightened around the wheel. Why wasn't I seeing anything familiar? How could I still be on this road? In a panic, I kept driving, but the fog seemed to thicken more with every passing mile. It felt almost suffocating, as though the world itself was pulling in closer around me, slowly, deliberately. The trees too were changing. The branches, which I'd originally thought were just twisted, now seemed to be reaching for me, their shadows growing longer and more exaggerated, stretching across the road like arms trying to grab hold of my car. I shook my head, telling myself I was overreacting. But then I saw it. A shape. A figure standing at the side of the road just outside the reach of my headlights. It was too tall, unnaturally tall, with limbs that didn't quite look human. I couldn't make out details, but I could feel it staring at me. Watching. I felt my stomach twist, my pulse quickening as I glanced nervously at the rearview mirror. The figure hadn't moved. It was just there, as if it had been there all along, just waiting for me to see it. I hesitated. Should I stop? Should I go back? But no. There was nowhere to turn around. The road was too narrow, too winding. So I pushed my foot down harder on the pedal, hoping to speed past it, praying it was just my imagination. But as I sped forward, the figure remained there, perfectly still, unmoving, its eyes, if it even had eyes, burning into me from the darkness. The fog clung to the car like an oppressive weight, pressing in on me, suffocating every thought. I looked at my side mirror, and for just a split second I saw it move, just a flicker. It was closer, much closer now, and as I drove faster, it seemed to follow me, keeping pace with my car, keeping up with me in the same silent, unhurried way. That's when I realized I wasn't alone. Something was with me on this road. Something. Watching, waiting. I slammed my foot down even harder on the accelerator, but the figure stayed right there, as though it was part of the fog itself. I could barely breathe now. I had to get out. I had to turn back. But as I looked ahead, the road continued on, endlessly. Just more fog. Just more trees. And that feeling deep in my gut, that something far worse than a random encounter waited just beyond the curve. I couldn't stop my grip from tightening on the wheel. Every nerve in my body was telling me to get out of there, to put as much distance as I could between myself and whatever was lurking on this road. I pressed even harder on the accelerator, trying to outrun the growing dread that something was following me. But every turn seemed sharper, every curve more unnatural, like the road itself was shifting to keep me in its grip. Then I glanced in the rearview mirror and my heart froze. There it was again, a figure still and shadowy standing in the middle of the road. I only caught a glimpse of it before I had to look back at the road, but when I dared another glance, the figure had vanished. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the fog, just my mind playing with shadows, but I knew deep down it was more than that. My pulse raced, my palms sweaty as I forced myself to look ahead, pretending nothing was wrong. Then I heard it. A faint sound outside, at first just a whisper, but it grew louder. Footsteps, keeping pace with my car, echoing in the silence. Each step felt heavier, louder, like something was walking alongside me, just out of sight. I didn't dare look. My mind screamed for me to ignore it, to focus on the road. But then came another sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping on the windows. It moved around the car, first on the back window, then on the side, and finally, it reached the windshield. The taps were light, almost playful, but they had an undeniable urgency, as if something wanted in. I could barely breathe. Desperately, I pressed harder on the gas, trying to lose whatever was haunting me. But no matter how fast I went, the tapping only grew louder, each knock seeming to echo with a twisted sense of satisfaction, as if it were enjoying my fear. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the tapping stopped. The silence returned, heavier than before, pressing down on me like a weight. I chanced a quick look in the rearview mirror, and there it was. Closer this time. The figure's features were clearer now. A tall, twisted form with limbs too long and a face partially shrouded in shadows, yet I could make out a crooked, unnatural grin. Its hollow eyes seemed to be fixed directly on me, filled with something dark and unfeeling, as though it was watching and waiting for the right moment. Panic surged and I pressed the pedal to the floor, the car lurching forward. The road grew narrower, each turn coming faster, sharper. My pulse pounded in my ears as I fought to keep control of the wheel, the fog closing in around me. I dared one last look back, but this time the figure wasn't on the road. It was inside the car. I barely registered the shadow in the back seat, but I felt its presence, chilling and oppressive. My heart thundered as I whipped my head back around, forcing myself to look forward, refusing to acknowledge what I'd just seen. I drove on, praying it was just a hallucination, a nightmare I could wake up from. But the road kept stretching on, endless and unchanging, and that feeling of being watched, hunted, never left me. By this point, my heart was hammering so hard I could barely think straight. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd wandered somewhere I wasn't supposed to be, a place that wasn't meant for the living. Every instinct told me to turn back, but something deep down told me it was already too late for that. In a last-ditch attempt to calm down, I pulled over to the side of the road, hoping a few breaths of fresh air might clear my head. As I stepped out, an unnatural stillness settled around me, the kind that feels as if the entire world is holding its breath. I took a few steps away from the car and looked around. The fog had thickened to a suffocating wall, and the road was barely visible. The twisted, looming trees surrounding me seemed almost alive, watching me as I stood there. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, handprints. On the back window of my car, smeared in the dust, were large, pale handprints, with fingers that looked abnormally long, stretched as if they'd been pressing hard against the glass. I was sure those handprints hadn't been there before. A cold sweat trickled down my spine as I remembered the strange noises, the tapping. It was as if something had been trying to get in. My hands shook as I climbed back into the car and locked the doors, my breaths coming fast and shallow. I fumbled with the keys, desperate to restart the engine. The car finally sputtered to life, and as the headlights flickered on, the radio burst into static. I jumped, reaching to turn it off, but then I heard something through the crackling, something that sounded like a voice. It was faint, distorted, but unmistakable.
"You shouldn't be here."
The words were a low, menacing whisper, spoken in a voice that was barely human. I felt my chest tighten, my heart pounding as if it might burst. I forced myself to look straight ahead, refusing to check the mirrors. I pressed down on the gas, accelerating down the road, desperate to escape whatever nightmare I'd stumbled into. But as I drove, I felt a cold, heavy presence in the back seat, as though someone, or something, was sitting right behind me. The air in the car felt thick and stale, and my skin prickled with dread. Every nerve in my body screamed for me not to look, but I couldn't help it. I glanced at the rearview mirror just for a split second. That's when I saw it. A figure sat in the back seat, shrouded in shadow. Its eyes were hollow, dark, and endless, and its mouth twisted into a smile that was too wide, too unnatural. My breath caught in my throat as it leaned closer, its gaze fixed on me as if savoring the fear in my eyes. I whipped my head forward, forcing myself to ignore it, praying it would disappear. But when I glanced up, I saw it standing outside my window, staring in, its face pressed against the glass, those empty eyes locked onto mine. A voice echoed in my head, a whisper that sounded like the scrape of metal against bone.
There's no way out.
And just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, leaving me in the silence and fog once more. But I knew with a sickening certainty that I wasn't alone on this road, and that I would never truly leave it. Fear gripped me like a vice, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. I needed to escape, but the road twisted and stretched as if it were mocking me, trapping me in its endless maze. I pressed down on the gas, the car lurching forward, headlights barely cutting through the thickening fog. The trees on either side seemed to close in, branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers, twisting closer and closer. I glanced down at my phone, hoping for a miracle, some sign of signal that might show me the way back. But the screen glitched, flashing between static and a single time, 3:33 a.m. It blinked like a warning, a countdown to something I couldn't understand. Then just as quickly the screen went black. As if in response, the car's lights flickered and my heart sank. I hit the dashboard, begging the engine to hold on. The last thing I needed was to be stranded here. But then, just ahead in the road, I saw it, the figure. It stood directly in my path, unmoving, its hollow eyes fixed on me. There was no way around it, and my foot slammed on the brakes instinctively, bringing the car to a screeching halt. My blood ran cold. The figure was closer than ever, and this time I could see its face clearly. It was twisted and pale, with a grotesque, almost delighted grin stretching across its face, as if it had been waiting for this moment. It raised one skeletal hand and pointed directly at me as if marking me. Panic surged through me and I forced myself to look away, jamming my foot down on the gas. I drove forward, right through where the figure stood, but when I looked back it was gone. Relief flooded me for a brief moment, but that feeling didn't last. Out of the corner of my eye, I sensed movement in the back seat. My throat went dry and I dared to glance in the rearview mirror. There it was, sitting right behind me, its hollow eyes staring at me through the mirror. Its mouth twisted into that impossible smile, wider and wider, and in a voice that felt like ice piercing my ears, I heard it whisper,
"You can't escape."
A jolt of pure terror shot through me. I gripped the wheel, staring straight ahead, refusing to look again. The road began to shift, narrowing into a single path, lined with trees that seemed to reach out, as if trying to pull me into the darkness. My heart pounded as I pushed the car to its limits, the engine roaring as I tried to outpace whatever horror was clinging to me. Then, out of nowhere, I saw lights up ahead, an intersection. Relief flooded through me. It looked just like the place I'd turned off from earlier, like the exit back to reality. I pushed the car harder, desperate to reach it. But as I got closer, a sickening realization hit me. It was the same intersection I had passed when I first took this road. I felt my stomach drop. I had been driving in a circle, trapped in an endless loop. I was back at the beginning, as though I'd never left, as though the road itself was holding me here. I slowed to a stop, too exhausted, too defeated to keep going. But the car didn't stop, it kept going as I saw it. A scene as if seen through a gigantic glass window. Daniel talking to a policeman, a patrol car parked beside the road with the lights on. He was gesticulating frantically as if explaining something. An ambulance. Emergency light sticks thrown along the dark road. A destroyed car. My car. I tried to scream. To make Daniel hear me, But then I saw one more thing that made me lose my breath. A body covered with a silver blanket in the middle of the road. My body. I remember now. I was hit by a truck. Just as I had entered the road. When I saw Daniel in my rearview mirror, he was trying to warn me. The figure appeared again, standing at the edge of the fog, watching me with those hollow, unblinking eyes. I didn't need it to speak to know what it meant. I was never leaving. This road wasn't meant for anyone to escape. It was a prison. I was lost and I would never find my way back. As the fog swallowed everything around me, I realized with gut-wrenching certainty that I was just the latest victim on this road, doomed to drive its twisted path forever with no way out.